talk to me, I don't believe a word. Don't try to make me feel alright. All the love in all the world.
All right. Cool. So this is the American Reckoning podcast. I'm Paul, and that is Aaron, and we're going to talk about the Confederate flag, and the meaning of the Confederate flag, and it's, you know, what it symbolizes and what it does not symbolize. So you know, we've been saying for a while, when we start this off, our American Reckoning podcast, we usually point to that flag and some occasions, and you see it in our opening. And that by the way, that Confederate flag that you see in our intro is First Virginia Cavalry flag. It's like an original that was saved. But you know, we say don't be afraid of that flag, and we're kind of going to go through as to explain why. So you know, our podcast is about Confederate history and Southern heritage, and we talk a lot about our Confederate ancestors and, you know, how it relates today and how history is being systematically changed or transformed or erased or eradicated or reconceptualized, I think is a word that you used before, Aaron.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we see a lot of that, and we're here to, because one other thing that we noticed about the Confederate flag and its meaning and all that is, and I'll show you this later on in the podcast, and I'll actually take an occasion to share my screen, but later on. But I did a Google search on, you know, the Confederate flag. What does it mean? Just a simple question. And then I did that again on YouTube, which of course is owned by Google, just to see what surfaced up, and so we can kind of play around with that to see. But what it also kind of led me to look into a little bit, you know, in this show, this particular podcast is kind of getting back to basics as to what the Confederate flag means. So I didn't see anything on Google that really impressed me at all. And of course, there is some back and forth, even amongst the Confederate. When the committee was formed, when the Confederacy was formed in 1861, even they you know, struggled a little bit back and forth about what the Confederate flag would look like and what the symbols that would be on it meant, the stars, the colors, the banner itself, the national flag. So anyway, we'll get into that. So basically, I wanted to kind of start off, and what I'm going to do is kind of go through what the battle flag was, and so you see different versions of the Confederate flag, right? I mean, the one that sort of everyone's used to seeing is sort of, it looks like that, except that is actually a battle flag. It is not the national flag of the Confederacy. That's a Army of Northern Virginia replica flag. It's square, and we'll get into the details about what that is, but it's not the national flag, which I'll explain in a minute. It's square with the stripes. It's got the cross through it, the blue cross with the stars. And then of course it has a red field in the back. It's really used by the Army of Northern Virginia and a lot of Confederate infantry units on the battlefield. And so it has 13 stars, and those 13 stars represent the 13 states in the Confederacy. It included the 7 that originally seceded, and then the 4 additional states, and then 2 more, Missouri and Kentucky. The more rectangle version of the Confederate flag, the Confederate first national flag, which is called the Stars and Bars. And a lot of people think that the normal Confederate flag, the rectangle or the square one, was called the Stars and Bars, and that's incorrect. It's
Right.
actually it's the Stars and Bars were named, quote unquote, for the first national flag in early 1861, before the war even started. And then when the war started, uh, this flag that looks like a Betsy Ross, it also looks very similar to the U.S. flag. And I'll read an article that kind of describes that a little bit more later. But basically, it has 7 stars for the first 7 states that seceded from the Union. It was, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. But the problem with the flag is, and there's also some back and forth. Again, I'll read that later, but just for descriptive purposes now, when they first brought this out on the battlefield at First Manassas, where the two armies met and concentrated for the first time, and with all the battle confusion and the smoke and the craziness that happened on the battlefield, it looked very much like at a distance. It looked a lot like the U.S. flag, and so it caused a lot of problems. And I'll describe a little bit. General P.T. Beauregard was the first to really say something's got to be done. We can't use that. So that happened at First Manassas, and so they stopped using it. And then from then on, they used it up until May 1863. They used that first national flag as the national flag. And today, as I mentioned, people confuse that flag with the Betsy Ross flag, and some pro Southern Confederate heritage groups, they use it for kind of 2 reasons. And unfortunately, as the case is, a lot of when they use the real battle flag, or they use the rectangle version of the Blue Cross, which is actually a naval jack. It's actually a Confederate naval jack, and also the Army of the Tennessee used that later in the war, the rectangle version. But when they put this flag out, sometimes it's easily recognizable in today's society. Whereas the first national flag, because it looks like a Betsy Ross flag, doesn't cause so much controversy. So that's one of the reasons, the woke, ignorant types out there think it's a Betsy Ross flag. So it just doesn't get affected as much. But
Camouflage, yeah.
right. Then the second reason is they display it because it's not likely to get removed. So it's kind of become like this fallback flag to use out there. So you're not so outwardly offensive, which I think is a mistake. But I think a lot of people who really truly believe in it's nothing against the first national flag, but as we learn later, the real symbol of the Confederate flag has become the Blue Cross version, the battle flag, not the first national. So after the first national, they in May of 1863, they created a second national flag, and this flag, it replaced the stars and the bars, so the Betsy Ross look, and it used for the first time the battle flag, the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag. And this is the square version, and that was placed inside a white field, white background. But this became a problem as well on the battlefield, because with a very large white background, it looked like a truce flag. It looked like a surrender flag. And so not a very popular thing right off the bat. It did stick around until March 1865. And then it was replaced by the third national flag. And the third national flag, the only difference is it kept the battle flag, the main battle flag, square in the top left, and it kept the white background, but it had a very large red bar that went vertically down on the right side, and right across the big part of the white field. So that alleviated the problem of it looking like a big white flag out on the field. But by that time, it was not used. It was never used on the battlefield. So all the units in the Confederate Army had already adopted the regular Confederate flag, the battle flag, the square one, the blue cross, or the rectangular version that the Army of Tennessee used. So, after the war until today, it really, the battle flag really caught on as an emblem of the South and the Confederate Southern pride and the image of the South. It was that way pretty much up until the civil rights time. You had some issues, and we'll talk about that a little later. But the main problems have started just very recently, where the Southerners and even a lot of Northerners accept the history of the Confederate flag and its symbolism, and even come to find that it does mean states' rights. It means liberty. But this has been stolen by a lot of woke historical revisionists and Marxists to demonize and really steal that history and make it and turn it into a form of oppression. And this is, I mean, a full-on attack. In other words, the Confederate flag was never, ever, as we'll see, designed in the language of its creation, ever mention anything about slavery, white supremacy, or anything like that. But that is the narrative that the revisionists want. That is what they're teaching in schools. That is what they want everyone to know. That's a false narrative. That is a complete, utter lie. And there's nothing today and nothing in the past that had anything to do with racism, slavery, or white supremacy, or any of this other garbage that you hear. So, I wanted to show, and I don't know if you had any thoughts about what you think is going on, Aaron, about today with the use of the flag and what you've kind of seen and heard out there.
Well, heck, there's I think a lot of what the negative sentiment that's being used these days comes from some pretty simplistic suppositions that people make about the South. The South was pro-slavery, therefore evil, and therefore any symbol of theirs represents white supremacy and slavery and all that stuff, even if it was not designed to do that at all. But and there's also and you may be getting into this a little later, but the fact that Klansmen and things, people like that were did have a racial agenda, used it wrongly, by the way. It was not theirs to use. But they did, and I think that's something that is easily able to be brought against the flag by those who want to get rid of it for one reason or another.
Right.
But anyway,
let me read. So I'm going to read. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, I was going to read this article that really explains a little bit more detail of the flag. But before I do that, I did a little test before this because I really wanted to find out what was out there on the Confederate flag, aside from what I knew and and even then I'm learning a few things myself. But I'm actually gonna share my screen because I did a search on Google and I want to share what I found. So let me so can you see that?
Yep.
So when I first searched, this is YouTube actually. When I first searched, can you see this Google search here?
Yes. Yep. See
All
all
right,
your tabs and everything.
Right. I just put in pretty a simple question. What does a Confederate flag mean? So the first thing I find, and I'm just going to scroll down here, it shows nothing of a true historical explanation on Google. Of course, Google owns Wikipedia, so they always show this in the far right here, as if they're the arbiters of all truth.
Right.
Wikipedia is a complete disaster.
Yeah.
Full of falsehoods and full of, it's not even first person stuff. They actually value second person. It's a total joke.
Right.
But as you go down here, I don't know if you can, I hope you can see this, but
yeah,
they have something from the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I was thinking to myself, what the heck is that all about?
Yeah.
The Confederate flag, the use of a symbol. So it's not even what the Confederate flag means. They have this incredibly biased junk here. And I'm going to click on this here in a second, but I'll come back to this. The next thing is this thing called YouGov.com, what the Confederate flag means today in America. And this is another pathetically written. If you look at the statistics, they did their own survey after 2020. I'm sorry, after the incident in Charleston with the nut job who had the Confederate imagery behind him, and they associated the Confederate flag that was behind him with racism and murdering black patrons of a church, and that's what this is about.
Right.
They actually, so I looked at this Encyclopedia Britannica. This actually isn't bad. It talks about the white stars and the blue canton on the back and so on. And so you got some good information here. It's not biased. So at least they have something there. But then all of this, National Geographic, very biased, one-sided in their article when I went through this. Wikipedia, of course, we talked about. Study.com is a complete disaster. They have Teen Vogue. I mean, what does the Confederate flag mean? And you've got Teen Vogue. And this is like number 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Number 7.
Teen Vogue.
Number 7 on the drop down.
Unbelievable.
On the search list. They got some crap from the Anti-Defamation League. Something called The Conversation. They finally have HistoryNet, which we also know is woke. But these articles also, nothing is relevant and recent. All this stuff is from 2020.
Right.
It's a complete, The Guardian, the bastion of conservatism. It's nothing but a mouthpiece for the left, as everybody knows. Something from Animals A to Z. I mean, it's just so bad.
Yeah.
Reuters, finally they have something from the American Civil War Museum from 2018. And they talk, the explicit use of Confederate as a symbol of segregation became more widespread. So, I mean, you can imagine what some of this crap is.
Yeah.
Of course, the Washington Post, they've got to have that up there to make Jeff Bezos happy.
Right.
It's just on and on. Vox, another left-wing nutbag outlet, CNN, but really nothing of use.
Yeah.
Okay. And if I searched what does a Confederate flag stand for, I would get the same thing.
Right.
So variations of the same question. But I want to click on this real quick. And really, this is such this is just a little short little thing here, right? That's it. And then they have this video. Let's listen to the video.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Mack, the Vice President for Marketing at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Along with our partners, the New York City Human Rights Commission and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's important discussion on the history and usage of the Confederate flag. This program is personal for us at the museum. Very early in the morning on January 7th, the day after the insurrection at the US Capitol,
The insurrection at the
Confederate flag was
Capitol.
tied to the front doors of our museum in the middle of the night. The people who did this could have used a Nazi flag, but they chose to target a Holocaust museum in New York City with a Confederate flag. We recognize that interesting and disturbing set of facts as a powerful prompt for.
So we're not gonna watch the whole thing, but
Right.
I would bet money that this was a false flag,
Right.
whatever they call it, red flag situation,
Right.
where some nutbag, some left-wing nut, put a Confederate flag up there
Right.
just to stir up these crazy left-wing nutbags,
Yeah.
or maybe they did it themselves. I don't know. But that is just, it's so stupid on its face. And you see these left-wing goons here who, it's so typical of this, the narrative that is being,
Yes.
it's just unbelievable.
I mean, the Confederacy was not against Jews. The Secretary of State of the Confederacy was Jewish, you know. So
No, and the reason I bring this up, because aside from the fact that there's a Jewish sculptor that did the Arlington Cemetery design of the sculpture and the sculpturing of the Confederate statue there.
Yeah.
But the original flag, as I'll read here, the First National, there was a Jewish Confederate States representative who was Jewish who helped in the design of it and weighed in on it.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just another one of these ridiculous things. So anyway, let me flip over to YouTube. So what's happening? What's happening on YouTube? YouTube. So when I search the same question, what does a Confederate flag mean? This guy, of course, they always surface up. This guy, Clarence Page, who's a columnist for the Chicago Tribune, another, in the great city of Chicago, which is being completely decimated by left-wing goons for some time. But he talks about this gibberish about, and he puts this guy up there. There's a veterans march, and he is all about this guy. And I'll let you read this later. Watch this later. But he's talking about this guy who shows up with the Confederate flag, like if he's some racist or something.
Right.
And there's no justification. There's no, his argument and what he's talking about is so ridiculous. So there is something here. There is a guy here. This was 7 years ago. Also, there's 72,000 views. This is 9 years ago.
That's the
Why on God's name is that being surfaced up as the first video?
Excellent question.
That you would, this is 7 years ago. This is actually pretty good, but it's a very vanilla description by C-SPAN, which is describing in the Museum of the Confederacy. And this guy, this historian in there is expertly describing what the two flags are and so on. No big deal. And the rest of these are kind of like articles and stuff. 7 years ago, this is MSNBC. And of course, it's all biased against the Confederate flag and hate and all this stuff. There's this goofy little thing. So 7 years ago, again, what the Confederate flag actually represents. And there's some stuff. And then I found this thing. This is a salesman. This is a little skit that this production company did. And there's 2.9 million views. So I was like, oh, wow, that actually has some interest. This one has 11 million. Is the South racist? We asked South Carolinians. And it actually kind of goes against the narrative. But when I clicked on this video here, this earlier one, and I'm not going to go through the video. It's kind of like what this guy does. He's amongst three other white salesmen, and this is his first sales job, and he happens to make a sale to a white guy who's, typical 60-year-old white male in his home, and he's hanging up a Confederate flag in his house. So you can see this on your own, but because I don't want to.
Right.
But he comes in and he sits down and he actually makes a sale because the guy talks about the Confederate flag a little bit. It's a little disjointed, but it turns out that the white guy out there leaves him behind because he threw a rock into this older gentleman's house and then takes off, gets scared and takes off, and this guy comes out. So it's about racism, but not in the way that you would think. So what they're doing is they're blaming the white guys who left him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this weird, it's interesting video, but it's worth seeing. But so I started reading through this to find out, what people, being a black man that grew up in the heart of Appalachia, I grew up seeing the flag a lot. While there were racist people who flew that flag, there were also some very kind people who also flew that flag as well. As a matter of fact, several of my friends and neighbors had that flag, including, oddly enough, one who had left-wing ideals, most topics. And when my truck broke down, it was one of my neighbors with that flag that luckily saw me and picked me up. They also had my truck because it showed me that flag represents vastly different things to different people. And just because a person flies, it doesn't automatically mean they're racist. I'm a man of ethnicity, a Yankee from the North, a military veteran, a Harley rider. Several riders have the Confederate flag on their vest, and we ride together without any animosity. It's not the flag of your race. It's not the flag or your race. It's the content of your character that matters. I'm black, and I worked for DirecTV for 11 years, and some customers had the flag. They actually treated me better than my own race. Judge people how they treat you. So this is another African-American. The twist where the guy who threw the rock because he thought the guy was racist just to leave the black guy with him is a pretty accurate. Well, this guy was saying it's pretty accurate, but this is a woke. It's sort of a woke. If you see the contrived video, you see what I'm talking about.
Right. It's kind of a straw man. It sets it up and knocks it
exactly.
down.
Exactly. It's totally stupid. Wow, I'm a black man, and this actually happened to me when I used to sell life insurance, except the flag was on his truck. I rang the doorbell anyway because I drove 40 minutes to get to his home. Then I actually sold the insurance policy, and they were actually nice. So, I mean, I go on and on and on. If I go it really exposes, and there's a lot of people on here, even blacks, who do not agree. So it's kind of nice to see in a way. So, I mean, there's one good thing, and you have to find it in the comments, because what you'll notice that if you actually read some of these comments, they're actually very favorable to the Confederate flag and history.
Right.
So I bet you Google and YouTube would like to filter those out if they could. This one was interesting. This only has 28,000 views 7 years ago. And this chick goes on and on about how, and she's got the IQ of a squirrel. It's that bad. It is so bad.
You pick me up
You get through the.
when I am low.
I can edit this out.
From the histories of our country, not only is America going through this issue of dealing with a part of its symbolism from its past, but South Africa's gone through it recently. Any African country that has been colonized and released from colonization in the 20th century is going through, all going through these images of oppression that still exist in our modern day society and are still upheld as if we are supposed to honor them. So let's just go over some of the historical basics to understand where the Confederate flag came from. In 1860, right before the start of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was president. And the Republican Party spoke out against slavery being allowed in the expanding states. So back before the Civil War, we did not have all 50 states. Also, the ongoing things in those are two.
So I had to kind of go through here to find whether anything about the Confederate flag.
It sounds it sounds like a 7th grade history report.
It is so bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is what they surface up. Anyway.
Yeah,
so you kind of get that.
Right. It's pretty unsubstantive or just very poor, in whatever substance it's got. Well, and that's not too surprising. The information.
No, it's not surprising, but it's like
it just goes to show.
Now it's funny because if you actually put the real information, and I'm going to go through this article here that actually it does a pretty good job of describing exactly what went into the making of the flags and so on.
Right.
This would be banned.
Right.
You know what I mean? This would be shadow banned. That's all there is to it. I would be shocked if you see this podcast showing up in search results, even though it's explicitly named. We'll even take an experiment and name this. What does a Confederate flag mean?
Right.
All right. So, this article is from John M. Corsi, and he wrote this in about 2005, and it appears on Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech's, they have a site for Civil War studies. So let me read through this, and I'm not going to read everything because it's a little bit long, but I want you to just for educational sense, because it is pretty accurate in how it describes the making of the flags. But and I'll skip a little bit here in the beginning. Before exploring this rich history, it's necessary to clarify exactly what we mean when we talk about the Confederate flag or the Confederate battle flag. This exercise is both confusing and educational. The Confederate flag was not, in fact, the Confederate flag. The blue diagonal cross on the red field was never the official flag of the Confederate States of America. Okay, that's the one you see here. But it was the essential graphic element in the Confederacy's national flag beginning in 1863 and became the de facto symbol of the Confederacy then and now. It is similarly misleading to call the blue diagonal cross of the red field the Confederate battle flag. The Confederacy never designated a single pattern as the battle flag of its fighting forces. During the course of the Civil War, dozens of different patterns served as the battle flags of Confederate military units. Tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers marched and fought under those different flags, which meant more to them than did the flag later generations call the Confederate battle flag. 4 decades after the war, the United Confederate veterans imposed a uniformity that didn't exist during the war, officially designating the blue cross on square-shaped red field with the white border as the Confederate battle flag. Men who marched and fought under the flags protested in vain against this ex post de facto simplification of Confederate flag history. So the battle flag, you have to remember putting history in the time and the context of its proper, looking at it from the men who fought it and lived through the history of the time. A lot of the men who went to war, including one good example is the Turner Ashby Camp Mountain Rangers flag, which is a silk flag, and it was made by the women of Fauquier County.
It says right on it, yeah, the one presented to Turner Ashby.
Yeah, and so men, and the reason I bring this up in this context of this article is that men went to war and they were provided banners and flags that were made by their own communities, and they were given to their local companies to go to take with them to battle. And so they had a very strong affection and connection to those symbols, those flags. And so even the battle flag, which they later did accept, of course, they were going into battle carrying the Confederate flag, as I'll read here in a second, as we'll talk quickly about the 26th North Carolina. But it was a big deal to carry your flag into battle. Much more so because there was a battlefield role, a color bearer, that the responsibility and honor of carrying a flag in battle where you're going to be a major target of the enemy was a big deal. And so there's a deep affection and connection to these flags. And I just wanted to mention that, to put that in the context. So I'll read on. The version of this flag most often seen in the 20th and 21st centuries is rectangular and without a border. Those knowledgeable in the history of Confederate flags interpret this either as a late war battle flag of the Confederate Army of Tennessee or the naval jack used by Confederate vessels, which I mentioned earlier. The resemblance of the popular rectangular pattern is historically accurate Confederate flags. I'm sorry. The resemblance of the popular rectangular pattern to historically accurate Confederate flags is coincidental. Few people deliberately display a Confederate naval jack or Army of Tennessee pattern battle flag. Instead, the rectangular pattern is intended as a Confederate counterpart to the U.S. national flag, the Stars and Stripes. Because so many people perceive it as the Confederate flag, they almost subconsciously believe that its shape ought to mirror that of the American flag. This tendency to disregard as a counterpart to the Stars and Stripes also explains the popular fallacy that the Blue Cross flag was known as the Stars and Bars, a name that juxtaposes so neatly with Stars and Stripes. The Blue Cross flag was not and should not be called the Stars and Bars. So that's important to know because people make that mistake quite often. During the life of the Confederacy, the Blue Cross flag was in fact a practical and symbolic antithesis of the real Stars and Bars. Stars and Bars was the name given to the national flag of the Confederacy, adopted by the Confederate Provisional Congress of Montgomery, Alabama on March 4, 1861. It features 2 red and 1 white horizontal bars and a blue field in the corner called the Union or Canton, with white stars corresponding to the number of states of the Confederacy. Back then it was 7 when the original flag was done, when they first formulated this. At first glance, it looks like the Stars and Stripes. That's no accident. The congressional committee charged with choosing a flag found itself, quote, overwhelmed with memorials not to abandon the old flag. Accordingly, the committee bowed to the strong and earnest desire to retain at least a suggestion of the old Stars and Stripes, unquote. The chairman of the committee, William Porcher Miles of South Carolina, disagreed vehemently with the majority on principle and because he had championed an alternative design, a blue St. George upright cross on a red field. That was the original thought from him. Emblazoned on the cross were 15 white stars representing the slaveholding states, and on the red field were 2 symbols of South Carolina, the palmetto tree and the crescent. Charles Moyse, a self-described, quote, Southerner of Jewish persuasion, unquote, wrote Miles and other members of the South Carolina delegation asking that, quote, the symbol of a particular religion, unquote, not be made the symbol of the nation. In adapting this design as the flag of the infant Confederacy, Miles, the chairman, removed the palmetto tree and crescent and substituted a diagonal cross for the St. George's cross. So not the upright vertical, but the cross, the diagonal. Miles explained that the diagonal cross was preferable because, quote, it avoided the religious objection about the cross from the Jews and many Protestant sects because it did not stand out so conspicuously as if the cross had been placed upright thus, unquote. The diagonal cross was, Miles argued, was, quote, more heraldic than ecclesiastical, it being the saltire of heraldry and significant of strength and progress from the Latin salto, to lead, unquote. The flag's patron may have considered it heraldic, not a religious symbol, but some of his contemporaries and subsequent generations have tended to identify it as indeed a cross. Some Confederates referred to it as the Southern Cross, a constellation visible only in the Southern Hemisphere and rife with sectional symbolism. Others began referring to it, of course, as a lot of us do, as the St. Andrew's Cross. And that's important because St. Andrew, let me just read on. The cross of St. Andrew is a familiar symbol in Western culture. The X-shaped cross derived its name from the first century Christian martyr who didn't believe himself worthy to die on the same kind of cross as Jesus Christ. Crucified in 69 AD, Andrew's remains were transported to the Scottish coast in the 4th century. He later became the patron saint of Scotland and his cross the symbol of Scotland. Although the mid-19th century South was steeped in Scottish literature and poetry, as we all know, there's a lot of Scots-Irish across the South, Appalachians, and so forth. The cross of St. Andrew was not widely used, and few Confederates viewed the Blue Cross flag as St. Andrew's with religious significance. Later generations have imbued the flag with a religious symbolism that that it did not carry during the life of the Confederacy, early on at least. Miles lost the battle to design the national flag, but he won the war to create the Confederate flag, as you will see. He correctly judged that the new nation would eventually reject a flag that imitated that of the nation from which it had just broken away. The Stars and Bars, the first national flag, soon proved impractical and symbolically inadequate. The first problems to emerge were practical. When Confederate regiments marched off to war in 1861, many carried the Stars and Bars as their battle flags. Intended primarily to assist commanders in locating and directing units in the field, battle flags that too closely resembled those of the opposing army's flags undermine that purpose. So he gives the example of the First Battle of Manassas in July 1861. At least one Confederate regiment actually fired on another Confederate regiment, possibly because of the inability to distinguish between the battle flags, and General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, during a critical point of the battle, could not even tell whether his army was being reinforced or flanked by the enemy. As did the other generals throughout the Confederacy, Beauregard determined to adopt a new and distinctive battle flag. For advice, Beauregard turned to a volunteer aide, William Porcher Miles, the same man who had been chairman of the Congressional Committee on the Flag and Seal. Beauregard wrote to his new commanding officer, General Joseph E. Johnston, suggesting that they ask the War Department for, quote, badge flags made of red with two blue bars crossing each other diagonally, on which shall be introduced the stars, unquote. Johnston agreed, but suggested that the battle flag pattern should be perfectly square and thus better proportioned. The flags issued to the units of the Army were of standard size, varying according to service branch. The Army quartermaster arranged to make the prototypes of the pattern and consigned the task of making 120 silk flags to 75 women in 4 Richmond churches. On the afternoon of November the 28th, 1861, the Army assembled on the heights overlooking Centerville, Virginia, for a ceremonial presentation of the new battle flags. Quote, the troops looked well as the colonels successively received their colors to defend, wrote Staff Officer G. Moxley Sorrell. Read to the troops was a general order from Beauregard that infused the strange new battle flags with the same associations as the silk flags that many communities presented to their volunteer companies. Battle flags issued subsequently to the Army were not made of silk, but of wool, bunting, and differed slightly from the original issue and from each other in minor details. And you'll see this when you look through all the battle flags. They all have little variations. It's the primary square battle flag with the red and the blue bars and the stars, but it's got and of course a lot of the units started putting their battles on the actual flags, as we know.
Yeah.
So after the formal admission of Kentucky into the Confederacy in December 61, the flag bore 13 stars. Missouri as well was included in that, and you know all the others. While the name and elan of the Army in Northern Virginia awaited the command of Robert E. Lee in June of 62, by the end of 1861, the Army possessed the very flag under which it was to fight its greatest battles, and that is that square battle flag. The success of the Army with which that flag was associated and the importance of that Army in defending the Confederacy's independence may well explain why the flag soon became the most important symbol of the Confederacy. Thanks primarily to its well-traveled patrons, Generals Beauregard and Johnston, the Blue Cross pattern was soon introduced to most other Confederate armies and departments. They took the pattern with them and sought to impose the same uniformity of flags on their new commands as they had done in Virginia. While many units in Western armies continued to carry national flags as battle flags or battle flag patterns adopted early in the war, the Blue Cross reigned supreme eventually throughout the Confederacy, certainly by 1864. When Joseph Johnston assumed command of the Army of Tennessee in late 1863, he introduced, as that army's official flag, a rectangular variant of the Blue Cross pattern, similar to the Confederate naval jack and the version most widely seen in modern America. So, in all theaters of war, and I'll go on here, battle flags of all patterns served important practical and especially emotional functions. And I mentioned this earlier about the color bearers. I'm going to talk about it. Flags were tangible cloth embodiments of military units' esprit de corps and camaraderie. Carrying the regimental colors was a high honor and grave responsibility. Losing colors, a source of grief, and usually an indication of high casualties. Stories of men picking up the regimental colors from the hands of fallen comrades are based on actual, very real heroism of men such as the 14 members of the 26th North Carolina Infantry who fell carrying the regimental flag on the first day of Gettysburg. In this way, the battle flag was consecrated on the field of battle. Just as the Stars and Bars proved impractical as a battle flag, it proved uninspiring as a national flag, and for the same reason that it had been adopted. Influential Southerners and Southern newspapers began lobbying as early as August 1861 to replace it. And the flag was denounced as servile imitation of the Stars and Stripes and, quote, too much like the old concern for the emblem of a separate and independent nation, unquote. The new Confederate Congress appointed a new flag committee, which reported in April 62 that any new pattern must symbolize, quote, our absolute severance from the United States and the complete separation of every sentiment indicating the faintest hope of reconstruction, unquote. Significantly, when the Confederate people were ready to symbolically declare their absolute severance from the old Union, the blue diagonal cross was the pattern that made this statement of heightened new nationalism in the Confederacy. The cross symbolized the rejection of the sentiments reflected in the Stars and Bars. The Confederate nation was ready to adopt William Miles's pattern as its national flag in 1863. On May 1, 1863, and I skip on a little bit, the Confederacy adopted a new national flag, the so-called stainless banner, which emblazoned the square blue cross battle flag on a white field. So they took the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag and they put it on the white field. This was the first official government recognition of the Confederate battle flag. Reaction to the new flag was very favorable. Quote, the new flag, which was displayed from the Capitol on Thursday, May the 14th, 1863, it is gratifying to say, gives universal satisfaction, commented the Richmond Daily Dispatch. And I go on to quote, almost any sort of flag to take the place of the detested parody of the Stars and Stripes for so long, the lawful emblem of the Confederacy would have been hailed with pleasure, unquote. The new flag was all the more satisfactory because in it is preserved the immortal banner, the battle flag, which has been consecrated on so many battlefields. Then in March 1865, the Congress modified the design again, reducing the whiteness of the background by adding a vertical red stripe to the flag's edge, creating what is known as the third national battle flag, which we talked about. So, talks a bit about going on about after the war during Reconstruction and kind of back and forth about there was a little bit of time here where the government of the United States, the War Department, wanted to take away these flags, and there was a little bit of, and there was a lot of pushback, so they abandoned that. And then it talks a little bit about some of the reconciliation efforts, first by Grover Cleveland, to return some of the battle flags to the Southern people, to the Southern states. And it was completed by Theodore Roosevelt, where Cleveland failed to get it all done. He talks about here in the article that Theodore Roosevelt actually managed to complete that. In the I'll read here, in the half century after Reconstruction, when Confederate veterans and their generation were the leaders of Southern society, Confederate flags, especially those of the Blue Cross pattern, enjoyed a status and high public profile. The flag was used widely in rituals relating to mourning Confederate dead and celebrating the cause for which men fought and died. It was naturally a fixture at Memorial Day observations, veterans reunions and parades, and meetings of the various Confederate ancestral organizations, United Confederate Veterans and so on, UDC and so on. Significantly as an object of reverence, its use was all but restricted to such appropriate memorial activities. An informal but effective taboo precluded its use as a political and commercial symbol. Exactly how the flag came into widespread use as something other than Confederate symbol may never be known, but some patterns are clear. And he goes on about it becoming a symbol not just of the Confederacy, but more generically as a symbol of the South and Southern pride. By the 1930s, the flag was a presence on Southern college and university campuses, including the Kappa Alpha fraternity at Washington College in Lexington. Robert E. Lee was the president. So the Heritage Organization as a fraternity, Kappa Alpha, used the Confederate flag quite a bit. So I'm going to skip on here and then I'll conclude this. But I want to fast forward up to 1987. Because, and I'll go on here because this is when you first started to see this outrage over the Confederate flag. And this new activist role in trying to remove the Confederate flag in multiple places across the states. And so that's covered here a little bit. So let me go on. In 1987, the Southeast region of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, launched a campaign to remove Confederate symbols from public spaces, and especially from the state capitals of South Carolina and Alabama, and the state flags of Georgia and Mississippi. This organized effort provoked an equally organized Southern heritage resistance that fought to protect the Confederate symbols on the landscape and rights of individuals to display them. This was all fought in the courts, state legislatures, the streets, the media, and the court of public opinion. The intense battles over the flag garnered national and even international headlines. Only in Mississippi was a decision to keep or replace the blue cross Confederate flag put to a popular vote, and only there was it retained. So we'll show you all the different flags of the states, the 13 states. And we'll so you can see how the Confederate flag, the bars, the colors, the symbols still kind of retained in those states because of that Southern heritage and that affiliation, that strong connection to the Confederate. Fast forward to today. And the reason I brought that up in 1987, because what you see in the 80s is this concerted effort to begin to destroy history. And I tie that again, the way Confederate symbols and the Confederacy and Southern heritage and is being completely, it's the low hanging fruit.
Right.
Even back then, they first looked at it as that way.
Right.
And there was a first concerted effort up to that point, remember. And even today, you saw in some of the comments, I mean, a lot of people say, hey, it's history. What are you doing? But people have to understand there is an absolute Marxist effort to destroy all the symbols of American history. The Confederate stuff is just easy street for these people. But but a lot of Southerners like us are fighting back any way we can.
Right.
Look, I mean, I mentioned the Betsy Ross flag. Does anybody really think that these people have any problem removing the Betsy Ross flag someday? Or certainly the United States flag? They don't.
Right. Anything that reminds us of who we are, because that's what they're trying to defeat.
Yeah, so when you see this flag, this flag does not have, they can force a narrative of slavery and white supremacy and all this. And yes, we know slavery existed. We know slavery existed in both the North and the South. That is a a troublesome thing that we can never, it is what it is.
Right.
But that does not, that's part of history. That's okay.
Right.
We as Americans should be proud of that, the good and the bad. And
yeah,
and the
absolutely.
Confederate flag is cool. It's still cool. It looks cool. It's badass. Everybody knows it.
Yep.
And
I mean, people fly it in other countries too,
Yeah.
Yeah, you go to a big heavy metal festival in Germany, you will see battle flags. In England, you will see battle flags, so yeah, a lot of people, it's a flag that kind of came from us, our history, but yeah, other people identify with it too. So I think a lot of people would be surprised by that.
Yeah, I think so hopefully you guys learned something about the Confederate flag and its true origin, the formation of it, some of the back and forth, what the stars mean and the blue and the cross. I think, yeah, you can argue if it's St. Andrews or the Southern Cross in the sky, or the red, you can argue with that and go back and forth. That's fine. But I guarantee you, it doesn't mean slavery. There's nothing in the documentation, their arguments or anything that had anything to do with white supremacy and slavery and racism. This is all a freaking lie.
Right.
It's a complete, utter lie. So don't get fooled. Don't get woked out. Don't go stupid and ignorant. Actually learn, figure it out. And we'll see if this, what the Confederate flag means actually shows up in any search, which I doubt, but we try our best. So, but anyway, thanks for joining us. Remember, we'll have some more episodes. This is one of our educational ones, I guess you can call it.
Yep. We'll do a few basic ones here.
Yep. So thanks for joining us. And it's American Reckoning Podcast. Make sure to subscribe at American Reckoning on YouTube. And we'll see you guys next time.